Rolling in there?
Yeah, I'm recording, so whenever you're ready.
Okay, great. Hello and welcome. I'm Walt McCree, Chair of the Public Banking Institute with the Public Bank Solution television program, returning again for our second edition of this new program, talking about public banking, and fortunately having in the studio with us the founder of the public banking movement, Ellen Brown. Ellen, welcome back.
Thanks, Walt.
Yeah. The conversation about public banking is emerging all over the country. There are now over 30 different cities, counties, and states that are at some level of development in examining why they might want to have a public bank. And most of that investigation is around the fact that states are consumed with ongoing and chronic debt. Debt that is extracting billions, hundreds of billions of dollars out of the American economy and shifting it into private hands in the banks of primarily a handful of banks that are, one could say, I think fairly, running the world. I'd like to ask you about that. I think that it would be useful because most people don't have much familiarity with what money is. It's a rather secretive sort of a mysterious sort of a environment. People know what it is in their wallet, maybe on their credit card, but what is that? You know, what really is money? So let's start at that. What is money really?
Well, most people think of coins and dollar bills, of course, with pictures of presidents on them. So you assume that money is something that's issued by the government. But in fact, coins make up, I think the last figure I saw was $40 billion. There are $40 billion worth of coins out of a money supply that's over 10 trillion. So it's just a minuscule part of the money supply. And coins are the only thing actually issued by the U.S. government, meaning the Treasury.
But you're not talking about paper dollars here then?
Those are
okay.
Actual
Anything,
physical
currency.
metal coins. No, those are coins.
Okay.
Then paper dollars are issued by the Federal Reserve. Again, there's still a very small portion of them. Between the two of them, I think it's like 3% of the whole money supply.
Right.
So it's a very small, or no, wait, sorry, 3% includes, okay, scratch that. Anyway, I think it is 3% of the money supply.
Yeah.
So dollar bills are issued by the Federal Reserve, which is a bank. It's 12 branches, all of which are 100% owned by the banks in their districts. So in that sense, it's private. But the main thing is those paper dollars are not printed and just spent into the economy the way the American colonists did it, or the way Abraham Lincoln did it during the Civil War. They are printed and lent or bought, sold into the economy. In other words, banks need paper dollars, and so they'll buy them with their digital currency. And so all of the rest of the money, so those are loans in themselves. They're not money, they're not sovereign money that's just spent. The only sovereign money that's just spent are coins.
I want to emphasize that point because I think most people would have trouble believing that we're getting our money from a private source. The Federal Reserve. Let's just examine that for a minute, because there's, of course, the Federal Reserve is a target of a lot of conversation and conflict, I think, too. What the Federal Reserve is has a public mandate, but is privately owned.
Well, it's public-private because the Federal Reserve Board, of course, is appointed by the Congress, appointed by the President, confirmed by Congress, or whatever. Anyway, it's Congress and the President determine who the board is. But the Federal Reserve banks are privately owned. They all get a 6% dividend on their stock every year. That's mandated. Okay. So that comes out of. But on the other hand, the Federal Reserve does have some, well, theoretically they have communication with Congress and listen to Congress, but they don't necessarily, because
they can do what they like.
Exactly. Yeah, they're actually quite independent. They pride themselves on being independent.
And I love what Alan Greenspan said about that years ago. That no, we really don't have any accountability here.
Right. He said, yeah. He said,
we don't really have to tell you what we're doing. And that's a very interesting and really an essential point. I think people would be surprised to know that our money comes from a private source. I like to make this little metaphor about if inside of a family, and we'll consider our nation a family, if your parents want to give you your portion of money for spending, your appropriation, whatever it is, your allowance, it would be like, instead of your parents giving you your allowance directly, they make you go to your neighbor, and your neighbor is going to give you your allowance, and you're going to pay him. They're going to give you $5. You're going to pay your neighbor $1, to get your allowance. That's I want to say a perversion, or really the diversion of our current financial system. The Federal Reserve over here issues to us at expense our own money.
Yeah, well, and worse than that is that most of our money doesn't even come from the Federal Reserve. It comes from private banks, which you go to the bank to take it. It comes from loans from private banks. The Bank of England recently acknowledged this in a year ago in their quarterly report. They said, contrary to popular belief, banks do not merely take in deposits and lend them out again. Banks actually create deposits in the process of making loans. So when you go to the bank to take out a loan, they will write the amount of money that you just borrowed into your checkbook, or into your deposit account. So they've created that deposit. And on the other side of the book, so that's on one side of their books, they will call that a liability to themselves, because they have to cover that check when you write it. And on the other side of their books, they call it an asset to themselves, because you have agreed to pay that money back over time with interest. So you've actually agreed, if it's a 30-year loan, you've agreed to pay twice what you actually got out of the deal. So that is where virtually all of our money comes from. And the bank itself, when it needs dollars, like if you go to the bank and you want physical cash, the bank gets the dollars by buying them from the Federal Reserve with these digits that, this digital money that has been created as credit on the bank's books. So we have a middleman there that is private, that is sucking huge profits out of the system. I mean, some people say, well, the banker spends his money too, so that's okay. The money's available, but they don't. Rich people can only spend a very small portion of their income on consumer goods, and this is another topic, but on the question of whether there is enough money out there to buy the GDP that we've actually produced, there isn't, because workers and materials, or labor and suppliers, do not get paid enough to buy the things they just created. There's this huge drain of profits that are going out to banks and other users, or
the whole
rentiers, as they say.
Rentiers.
And then it going off to offshore tax havens, or just going into more money schemes where they give you the money like it's like a fishing line. They give you the money expecting to pull it back with a bigger fish on it. So they're always sucking more out, or more is owed to them than was put in.
So let me just say this again, because I think it's really an unbelievable realization that our money is made up out of at the moment of generating loans. So that if we own our own bank, for example, if we have a public bank owned by the people, when the public bank makes a loan for a purpose, public driven and decided purpose, it's making new money, actually new money for the economy, and spending it into the local economy through the loan structure. And that's really what's driving all of the investment in our country. It's coming out of that relationship of we can make our own money based on our assets and our credit worthiness. And the other part of this thing about the Federal Reserve that I think people need to note is if they ever doubted that they were independent and not reliant on approval of Congress to issue money. In 2007, or was it 2008, they issued $16 trillion overnight to banks around the world to bail out and to balance the bank accounts without doing anything for Main Street. Right? The Federal Reserve just issued this, and that went. Where did that money go?
Yeah, I think it was late 2008 and then 2009, and these were just backups for overnight loans for the banks. So here's how it works. Well, people say, why do they need our deposits if they're actually creating their money on the books? But here's the way it works. Let's say Bank A creates this. I'll get to your question, but I just wanted to get this whole structure in there. Yeah. Let's say Bank A creates a $100,000 loan for a mortgage or something, and so you pay that $100,000 by check to your seller of this house that you just wanted to buy. So the check goes into another bank. So Bank A will now have insufficient reserves. They have to keep a reserve account with the Federal Reserve. They will have insufficient reserves, and Bank B, where the check just went into, will have excess reserves. So Bank A ideally will balance its books with deposits because that's the cheapest way to get money.
At the end of every day.
Yeah, at the end of every day, they have to balance their books with the Federal Reserve or whoever the intermediary is. It's not always the Federal Reserve. So if they have insufficient reserves, they can borrow from Bank B, which has excess reserves, which is that very money that Bank A just created. So basically, they can create money at 5% or 8% or 16%, whatever they're lending it at, and then they can borrow it back to balance their books at 0.25%, which is the Fed funds rate. But in 2008, late 2008, when we had the crash precipitated by Lehman Brothers, the banks weren't lending to each other. There was a credit freeze. And so they couldn't get that. You'd create money, it went into another bank. Suddenly, you don't have enough reserves and there's no place to borrow it. The LIBOR rate, the London interbank offering rate went up to 5%. So it was like higher than the banks could make money off of. So they just weren't lending at that rate. And so there was a freeze and the credit system collapsed. It was just like what's happened in Greece recently, where the ECB, the European Central Bank, refused, cut off liquidity to the Greek banks. And so they're dead. They need that ability to borrow overnight to cover what they can't get from their own deposits. Yeah. So that's what happened in 2008, that the Federal Reserve then stepped in, what the ECB should have done for Greece and would do for its other banks apparently. But so the Federal Reserve stepped in and provided the liquidity for all these banks for all their daily movements of money, to the backup liquidity. So they really just created that on their books, and it all went away after it was lent overnight and it was paid back. In day after day after day, they would lend it overnight and pay it back. I mean, that's what Ben Bernanke objected. Well, it wasn't really 16 trillion because these were one-day overnight loans, repeated and repeated and repeated. But still, the point is they have infinite money to back up their own favored banks with.
And of course, another example of that is the QE system, the quantitative easing of the last several years, in which the Fed has been propping up bank balance sheets by buying crummy securities that compromised the national economy before. Correct? I mean, that's the way that's been played out.
Originally, the QE1 was really to help free up the banks by buying these toxic mortgage-backed securities off the bank's books. They couldn't sell them. They thought they could sell them, and these were made up of subprime mortgages. So they're stuck on their books, and therefore they didn't have the they couldn't meet the capital requirements to make more loans. So the Federal Reserve bought up the mortgage-backed securities to help the banks. But QE2 was something different. They actually bought federal securities. So that, to me, that shows the potential of a public banking system if it were, in other words,
If the Fed were public, you mean?
yeah.
Okay.
Well,
Give us an example
I mean,
of how that would look. I mean, if the Fed were actually a publicly owned bank or publicly managed bank, what could they do for us that
Well,
they're not doing now?
I think, and I'll get, lambasted for this, but I think they could buy up the entire $18 trillion federal debt with quantitative easing, basically by printing the money on their books. So you take in the bonds and you trade them for dollars. So now all those banks that had bonds on their books, or anybody who was holding a bond, suddenly has cash. Is that going to create, everybody screams that would be hyperinflationary, but in fact the bonds and the dollars are the same thing. I mean, they're both out there, they're both a form of monetary aggregate, something that you can spend. I mean, the bond is a little harder to cash than the dollar. But if you own bonds, it's because you didn't want to spend that money. You've got it tucked away somewhere. And I mean, nowadays, people are recommending holding your money in cash anyway. So it's just going to say on your account, you used to have a bond and now you've got cash. Are you going to rush out and spend that? No, that's still money you wanted to save for old age or whatever.
Yeah, so I guess illustrating it locally, if you had a local bank that could issue issue money for local purposes, local economies, then you'd have a whole new a resource for firing up the local economy, independent of what's happening in the global financial markets, where now 40% of our GDP is financial, which means that we're generating paper as opposed to products. In 2008, when the banks did what they did, the money for Wall Street, for Main Street, dried up. And our economy all over the country, really all over the world, of course, sank hugely. Great assets of equity sank. But not in North Dakota. And in fact, if you talk to the bankers of North Dakota, they said, oh, well, our credit never stopped flowing. And so consequently, in North Dakota in 2008, the only state with a public bank, they had a budget surplus. They said they were the only ones in the black. All the other states were broke. And the Federal Reserve was unwilling to give any break to the states, which would have been a fraction of what they spent on bailing out their banks. Right? Yeah.
Well, they actually said that it was not in their mandate. I mean, that's what Bev Bernanke said, that it's not in the Federal Reserve Act. But the Federal Reserve Act has been changed many times, so it's really up to Congress. If Congress wanted to do that, they could easily do that, say that the Federal Reserve can provide quantitative easing for the states. Now, interestingly enough, this is the very thing that Jacob Coxey recommended in the 1890s, that we should have an issue of greenbacks or government-issued money to you would lend it to the states interest-free, basically. So they would get the money, but they would pay it back, as opposed to getting it outright. You see what I mean? So it'd be interest-free loans to the states. So that's what they're doing for the banks, interest-free loans, virtually interest-free loans. Why not do it for the states? They've hurt the states. The states and cities are suffering because of Wall Street. Why cannot the central bank do for us what they did for the banks? So but the Federal Reserve is not going to do it on their own initiative. Congress is going to have to tell them to do it, or the president could do it by executive order. There are different ways you could do something by executive order. But there is a difference between a publicly owned, I mean, arguably the Federal Reserve is publicly owned. They certainly were created by Congress. Congress could change it. Congress has the ability to take over the Fed and do a totally public, something that's totally in the public interest. Whereas a state bank doesn't have that sort of power, a state publicly owned bank. But a state publicly owned bank can still create money in the form of credit on its books, just as all banks do, and then direct that for the benefit of the public.
So let's look at that for a minute, because that's really the topic in many states around the country now. Looking at the idea of creating a public bank on some municipal or state governmental level, city, county, state, with the idea of doing exactly that, leveraging their assets and their in many ways just like a home equity loan, where they have a certain values that they sit on, they hold, they own. Some of it's liquid, some of it's not liquid. They have tax income and so forth. A local bank would have the power, a local public bank would have those extraordinary powers to finance things that now the cities have to borrow from the neighbor at expense, right? I mean, how does that work? So let's say you're the state of New Jersey, and you've got you don't have enough money to build your roads. The transportation fund here is out of money, and the only way that the state people managers have is to raise money is to tax or sell or cut services, et cetera, et cetera. A very bad selection of options for any executive management. How do you make progress in that world when you're always paying debt? How would it be? How would the state of New Jersey, let's say, or any state, turn its assets into dollars that could be used to invest in itself?
Well, I'll use the example of California because we do have an infrastructure bank already, California State Infrastructure Bank, and a number of states have this. So they already own a bank, which is cool. That overcomes this argument that the state can't own a bank or that the state can't lend its credit, because it's doing it already. It says right in the infrastructure bank website, it says we issue the credit of the state. It says it right there. But what they are is basically a revolving fund. So they get money, they have a certain amount of money, and they lend it out for infrastructure, and then it gets paid back, and then they can lend it out again. But let's say you took that very same money that you've already got in your fund, and you use it to capitalize a bank.
Which is the nest egg that a bank uses from which it lends money.
But it can
multiples.
Yeah, right. It can lend multiples. That's the trick.
That's the trick.
So let's say let's say it was $20 million, which is the minimum to start a bank in California, and then you could pull $200 million of your own revenues out of JP Morgan Chase or wherever it is right now, put it in your bank. So you don't have to solicit for customers. You're not competing with your local banks. You are competing to some extent with Wall Street, but they don't seem to want our deposits anymore anyway. They've got excess reserves. So you're really not hurting anybody. Taking this money out of Wall Street, putting it in your own bank, now you can make theoretically $200 million in loans, except you've got to pull back $20 million for your reserves. So let's say you can make $180 million in loans. So instead of $20 million that you could have lent out to build a railroad or whatever you're doing, you now have $180 million that you can lend out, and you own the bank, so you get the interest back. So you don't have to worry about doubling. Whereas your bond issue would have doubled the cost because of the interest you pay to the bondholders. Because you own the bank, you get that profit back. So you get this railroad for half price, and you've gotten it with money that you just created out of nothing, out of your... Now, what the legislators say, which I've heard two legislators say this, we don't have the money to lend because we need our revenues for our state budget. But this misconstrues the nature of banking. That's not how banking works. You take those revenues, you put them, they're now on deposit in a bank, right? They're now on deposit in Wall Street. So all you're doing is moving them into your own bank. Wall Street is going to lend that money, leverage that money the same way that you're going to do with your own bank. Only Wall Street is going to keep the profits. So you have not changed anything. Your deposits are available for spending. If you spend all your revenues, let's say you have a bad year like 2008, and you wind up spending every penny of your budget money that's there. Of course, you have taxes coming in all the time. That's the way, But let's say you wind up spending it all. You can borrow to make up the difference from the other banks. That's the way the banking system works. So you can borrow it at 0.25%, the Fed funds rate. And meanwhile, you have lent this out to your well, if it's to yourself, basically you're getting interest-free loans instead of loans at 10% or whatever, 8%, whatever your bond issue is at, or 5%, 3%.
So I want to just take a minute here. We're actually on the long side of this conversation, but I just really want to make the point about how the banking franchise works and why the public bank opportunity is a solution to the crisis, and that is that we're able to leverage ninefold, tenfold the assets that we put into the bank to create, to move our economy. So when you're lending out, let's say the 200 million you're talking about, as Ellen said, you know, you're also getting interest back from that, building the nest egg of the bank so that it's able more so to lend even more money, and it all stays at home. Whether it's the state or the city or the county, it doesn't go to New York, it doesn't go to Brunei, it doesn't go to corporate bonds or foreign currencies. Your money stays at home in a powerful little financial engine that's designed and committed to serving of the local purpose and mission as defined by the people. There are a lot of dimensions to this thing about money, Ellen, and I think I think we all we have a debt of gratitude to you for bringing this out, and I really want to take the opportunity to point out for you, if you you'd be fascinated, I think, to learn the history and the chapter and the verse of this by Ellen's book here, which I'm going to called The Web of Debt, which was her first piece done a couple of years ago, which describes the history of the financial situation, predicament systems that we're in, and then the more recent book, The Public Bank Solution, which describes how public banks respond inside that system with making it work for the people instead of private interests. We have much more to talk about here. This is it's a very exciting topic for people who are concerned about not just the inequities that are built into the system for the privateers, the private money changers who have been around for thousands of years, but about the fairness of the economy and the how people can make their way forward when we're all struggling with being slaves of debt, touched in debt slavery. Ellen, thank you very much. We'll be talking more about this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Again, Walt McCree with the Public Banking Institute. If you would like to find out more about public banking between watching this show, which I'm sure you'll be doing next time, visit the publicbankinginstitute.org, publicbankinginstitute.org. Or if you're here if you're in New Jersey, you can go to bankingnewjersey.org and take a look at what's going on in the public banking frontier here in New Jersey as well as around the country. It's very exciting. Thank you again for joining us.